So if you've been following this series, you know that hormone suppression in masters endurance athletes isn't random. It follows a very predictable cascade. Chronic training stress elevates cortisol. Cortisol suppresses testosterone through two distinct mechanisms. DHEA declines, thyroid conversion gets impaired, and sex hormone binding globulin rises to bind whatever testosterone remains. The physiology is interconnected and the pattern is very readable. So today we're getting into how to actually read it, what to test, why each marker matters specifically for athletes over age 40 or so, and how to interpret what you find as a system rather than a collection of isolated numbers. Because here's the thing about hormone testing for masters athletes specifically. The standard approach to hormone testing was not designed for someone training 10 or 12 or more hours a week at this stage in life. Reference ranges are population averages. They're built to identify disease in sedentary or lightly active people, not to evaluate whether a masters athlete has the hormonal environment needed to actually perform, recover, and adapt. That gap between what's flagged as abnormal and what's actually optimal for performance is where most masters athletes get lost, told their labs are fine when feeling progressively worse. Hi, I'm Dr. Jason Barker. I'm a naturopathic doctor, two-time Ironman finisher, lifelong endurance athlete, and 20 plus years working with endurance athletes, many of them navigating exactly this transition. So let's go through the full panel and what each piece actually tells you. The first and most important marker is testosterone, but total testosterone alone is not enough, and this matters more after age 40 than at any other stage of one's athletic life. Total testosterone measures everything in circulation, both the bound and unbound forms. But most of that circulating testosterone is bound to proteins and biologically unavailable to your tissues. So what your cells actually use is free testosterone, the unbound fraction that can enter cells and bind to the androgen receptors. The variable that controls how much is free versus bound is sex hormone binding globulin, or SHBG. SHBG binds testosterone tightly and renders it biologically inactive. And here's what's critical for masters athletes. SHBG naturally rises with age, which means the free fraction of testosterone declines faster than total testosterone does. An athlete in their late 40s or early 50s can have total testosterone that looks acceptable on a standard panel, comfortably within the reference range, while free testosterone is significantly suppressed because sex hormone binding globulin has risen enough to bind a disproportionate amount of what's circulating. This is one of the most common patterns I see in masters athletes who've been told their testosterone is fine, the total number looks okay, but nobody measured free testosterone or sex hormone binding globulin, so the actual functional availability was never evaluated. That's a testing gap that explains a lot of unresolved symptoms. So the testosterone panel for a masters athlete needs to include total testosterone, free testosterone, and SHBG. Always all three together, because the relationship between them is what tells you what's actually happening at that tissue level. And this applies equally to women as well, where even small changes in free testosterone availability can produce significant functional effects because baseline levels in women are lower to begin with. Now, the second marker is cortisol, and specifically cortisol rhythm, which requires a different kind of test than most doctors are going to order. As we covered in detail in the last video, cortisol sits at the center of the suppression cascade. It suppresses gonadotropin-releasing hormone, reduces luteinizing hormone output, and competes for shared adrenal precursors with testosterone. The pattern of cortisol across the day matters as much as the absolute level, probably even more. So a single cortisol blood draw gives you one data point at one moment in time. It can't show you whether cortisol is chronically elevated throughout the day, whether it's lost its normal morning peak, or whether it's inverted, elevated at night when it should be low. Each of those patterns has different implications and requires a different intervention. Now, what's useful is a multi-point salivary cortisol test, 4 samples collected across the day that map the full diurnal curve, collected at morning, midday, late afternoon, and evening. That pattern tells you whether the HPA axis, hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, is at an appropriate stress response state, whether it's chronically overactivated and stuck elevated, or whether it's exhausted and flattened after prolonged training. For masters athletes specifically, this is often the most revealing piece of the panel because the cortisol pattern frequently explains multiple other things that look disconnected. Things like poor sleep, suppressed testosterone, impaired T3 conversion, elevated sex hormone binding globulin. These often trace back to a dysregulated cortisol rhythm as the upstream driver. Now the third marker is DHEA-S, measured with a simple blood test. DHEA-S is the sulfated storage form of DHEA, dehydroepiandrosterone, and it's one of the most consistently overlooked markers in hormone testing for athletes. DHEA is produced by the adrenal glands and serves as a precursor to both testosterone and estrogen. So beyond its precursor role, DHEA has independent anabolic effects on tissue repair, immune function, and energy metabolism, to name just a few. And it's the adrenal hormone that declines most rapidly and consistently with age, more so than cortisol, and in many cases more dramatically than testosterone over that same time period. So for masters athletes, DHEA-S provides two important pieces of information. First, it tells you about overall adrenal anabolic capacity. Low DHEA-S alongside low testosterone suggests the adrenal system is producing less of the anabolic hormones across the board, not just in one pathway. Second, the ratio of cortisol to DHEA is clinically meaningful. A high cortisol to DHEA ratio reflects a system that's allocating adrenal output heavily toward stress response at the expense of anabolic function. That ratio often tells a more complete story than either marker does alone. Now, in the context of overtraining specifically, DHEA-S tends to decline as the HPA axis becomes increasingly dysregulated. It's essentially a marker of how much the stress response has been dominating adrenal output over time. Seeing low DHEA-S alongside dysregulated cortisol and suppressed testosterone gives you a very clear picture of an adrenal system under chronic stress. Now the fourth area is estrogen, and this applies to both men and women, though in different ways. So in women over 40, estrogen is often the first hormone that comes to mind in the perimenopausal context. And it's genuinely important. Estrogen affects bone density, cardiovascular function, muscle recovery, and sleep quality, to name a few. But the specific marker that matters most for active women in this transition is the relationship between estrogen and the other hormones, particularly how estrogen, testosterone, and progesterone are all interacting, as they all are shifting simultaneously. For active women navigating perimenopause, the full picture requires estradiol, progesterone, testosterone, and free testosterone, and sex hormone binding globulin together, because the relative balance tells you more than any individual number will. Progesterone, in particular, is often the first hormone to decline significantly in perimenopause, and it has direct effects on sleep quality, anxiety, and nervous system regulation that directly impact recovery and training tolerance. In men, the relative estrogen marker is estradiol as well, and this matters because some testosterone naturally converts to estradiol through aromatase, the enzyme found primarily in the adipose or fat tissue. In men with higher body fat, or in men taking testosterone support without monitoring conversion, estradiol can become elevated relative to testosterone. Elevated estradiol in men is associated with body composition changes, reduced libido, mood changes, and impaired recovery. And it's frequently missed because estrogen testing in men is often assumed to be unnecessary. For masters, male athletes carrying more body fat than they used to, or dealing with body composition that isn't responding to training, estradiol is very worth including. The fifth area is thyroid function, and as we covered in the last video, TSH alone is not sufficient. The full thyroid panel for a masters athlete includes TSH, free T4, and free T3. TSH is a pituitary signal. It's not a direct measure of thyroid output. Free T4 is the primary hormone produced by the thyroid, and free T3 is the active form that actually binds to receptors in cells and drives metabolic effects. A critical piece for athletes is the conversion step. T4 is converted to T3 in peripheral tissues, and that conversion is impaired by chronically elevated cortisol. So an overtrained masters athlete can have normal TSH and a normal free T4 and still have insufficient free T3 at the tissue level. The thyroid is doing its job just fine. The conversion step isn't, and you only see that if free T3 is specifically measured. So for masters athletes dealing with fatigue, cold intolerance, slow metabolism, difficult body composition changes, or cognitive sluggishness alongside the other symptoms we've been discussing, impaired T3 conversion is frequently part of that picture. And it's the piece that often gets missed because it requires specifically asking for free T3, which is not part of most standard thyroid panels. Now here's what makes this approach genuinely different from standard hormone testing and why the pattern matters more than any individual number. When you look at these markers all together, specific patterns emerge that tell you far more than just those isolated values. Some examples of what those patterns reveal include Number 1, low free testosterone with high sex hormone binding globulin and normal total testosterone, a bioavailability problem often age-related and addressable through specific interventions targeting sex hormone binding globulin directly. Number 2, low testosterone with elevated cortisol across the diurnal curve, stress-driven suppression through the gonadotropin-releasing hormone, luteinizing hormone pathway. Here, the intervention is managing the stress load, not treating testosterone directly. Number 2, low testosterone with elevated cortisol across the diurnal curve, stress-driven suppression through the gonadotropin-releasing hormone, luteinizing hormone pathway. Here, the intervention is managing the stress load, not treating testosterone directly. Number 3, low testosterone with low DHEA-S and flattened cortisol, a more advanced adrenal exhaustion pattern often seen in athletes who've been significantly overtrained for a prolonged period of time. The intervention here is more aggressive recovery support and potentially DHEA replacement. Number 4, normal TSH and free T4 with low free T3 alongside elevated cortisol, impaired peripheral conversion driven by HPA axis dysregulation. Addressing the cortisol pattern typically improves T3 conversion without directly treating the thyroid gland. Now, in perimenopausal women, declining progesterone alongside low testosterone and dysregulated cortisol creates a compound effect on sleep, recovery, mood, and training tolerance that explains a lot of what female masters athletes experience during this transition. These patterns are what move you from collecting numbers to actually understanding what's driving the picture, and from there to interventions that address the actual mechanism rather than just chasing individual values. So when should a masters athlete actually test? If you're experiencing declining performance despite consistent training, recovery that keeps getting worse, persistent fatigue that doesn't respond to rest, body composition shifting despite training and dietary consistency, or motivation and drive that have flattened in a way that feels different from normal fatigue, and you've already addressed training load, nutrition, and sleep as best as you can, that's when testing becomes the logical and most productive next step. The goal is never just to find what's low, it's to understand why it's low and which part of the system is the upstream driver here. Because when you fix the driver, the downstream markers often improve without directly treating them. So to bring this all together for masters athletes specifically, hormone testing at this stage of life needs to include total testosterone, free testosterone, and sex hormone binding globulin together, not just total testosterone in isolation. A multi-point salivary cortisol test for the full diurnal rhythm, not a single cortisol blood draw. DHEA-S for adrenal anabolic capacity, and the cortisol-to-DHEA ratio. Estradiol in men for aromatase conversion monitoring, and in women as part of the full perimenopausal hormonal picture alongside of progesterone. And a complete thyroid panel with TSH, free T4, and free T3 specifically. Read them as a system, not as individual numbers. The pattern is the diagnosis here. Please hit the like and subscribe if this was helpful. I post science-backed content for athletes navigating performance at every stage of life. And for individualized hormone testing interpreted through a performance lens for masters athletes, visit naturalathleteclinic.com. I'm Dr. Jason Barker. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.